Hey, welcome back to Balanced, the podcast where each month we examine a polarizing cultural topic and attempt to find a balanced way forward. In this episode, we discuss the institution of marriage. I'm Ben.
And I'm Steve.
And we're glad to have you with us.
All right. So I guess first thing I want to start with, just to let everybody know, Ben, is are you married, since we're talking about it?
I am married. I've been married for 6 years. My wife and I have been together for 16 years.
Wow. So was it, how long did it take you to know whether or not you're getting married? Was there many years that you knew we'll do it eventually, or?
Yeah, I think pretty early on. We met in college, and I think we both were kind of like, oh yeah, this feels right. This person is like, it just, when you know. And then after college, we were both trying to get our careers off the ground. I went to grad school down in Atlanta. We moved around a bunch. We lived in California for a little bit. And then we moved out to Chicago, and then she went to grad school. So there was just a number of things that we were doing before we eventually tied down.
Now, was it a thing where you felt like, well, we're going to do it once we're all done with all our school?
That was part of it. Because I think we wanted there to be a sense of like, okay, we're established now. There's some security. We're able to create some stability for ourselves before we involve the state in our personal lives.
Okay. Yeah, it makes sense. There's different strategies there. And it seems like, listen to that, I think about myself and I'm like, we were totally opposite. So, I have been married for 27 years. It will be in May. And we met and probably knew each other for 2.5 years, probably decided we were getting married after about a year, and thought like, this is something we're going to do. And what we did, I remember we were sitting at a restaurant at the bar waiting to be seated. They say it's full, go over there and sit down. And I was still in college working on, I at that point was still working on my associate's degree. And so on like year 2 of school, and she had was just graduating from college with a bachelor's degree.
Gotcha.
And we were there waiting, and we were like talking about it. And we're like, well, we're going to get married. And I said, I'm not going to take credit, but we both sort of discussed and said, well, if we're going to spend the rest of our life together anyway, let's just do this.
Uh-huh.
And so we did. Like when we got married, I made $8 an hour and she made $10 an hour. So it was like not quite as established as you guys.
Yeah, right. Well, I think there's virtue there too. It's just a matter of, right, you're on the journey together regardless. It's just a matter of how you do it.
And I think it's sort of the way you think about it. But people are different in that way. But so if you think about, probably I've known her since 1993, like 29 years, right?
Mm-hmm. Almost 30 years.
And how about because it sounds like Steve's been married 27 years. Oh, wow. But you've known your wife for 16 years, did you say?
We met in 2006. Yeah.
2006. Okay, good. So we've got a little experience to talk about this. Initially, when we put this topic up on our list of things to discuss, I was thinking, well, why this topic? You hear a lot of people just hearsay talking about, being against marriage, many young people these days. And some older people as well who maybe had a bad experience in a marriage. But so I did a little research and, found that a couple of stats that I thought they were pretty impactful. In 2020, the proportion of households in the United States consisting of married people was 49%.
I'm surprised it's that high, actually. That's essentially half.
Yeah, and I think that sounds high, but I'd love to see the numbers if I would go and do research on like the different cultures. Like how is Indian Americans, Asian Americans, African Americans, Caucasian Americans, and all the like, to see what those numbers, because I think some of them I have read like Asian Americans, for instance, it's very high. Like it's not going to be 49% for them,
Yeah.
But the reason that was shocking to me because in 1950, I know that's a while back, but in 1950, which is what you think, happy days and the World War II is over and everything's
Sure.
great, the number was 80%. 80% of households consisted of married people. What do you think about that?
Well, I think it's a sign of the changing times. I mean, I think one of the reasons why marriage is down generally is because people are probably becoming like more awake to the idea, more aware to the idea that it really isn't for everyone, and nor should it be. And not only that, but we live in a very different economic world than the one that existed in the 1950s. I mean, people just don't have the same opportunities. It feels like stability itself is a much further reach than it was for people back then. So I think that all of those things factor in.
I think we'll find in some of this research that I did that we'll go over here, that you're right, the changing times, and part of it has to do with in the 1950s, the percentage, I don't have that stat with me, but the percentage of women working and having their own established career was much slower than it is 70 years later here.
Right. And that connects to, the idea, because back then you could raise a family on one income. It's much harder to do that now.
Yeah. Yeah. So I like I said, I did a little research, and according to the American Psychological Association, healthy marriages are good for the couple's mental and physical health. So, there's a lot of people who are to say, I remember, I can tell you this, when I was in the Army, I got out of the Army in 1992. And that was the joke with everyone getting out who wasn't married, who was there. The young single guys did a 4-year tour in the military, and they're getting out and drinking beer and joking around and saying, oh, Gonzo is leaving, right? He's getting out of the Army, and man, you're going to be married in 6 months, you punk. That was the thing. And it's like, no way, man. No, not me.
Wait, so it was almost like an insult, like they were ragging on you.
Yeah. Yeah. Like, and I hadn't even met, my wife yet. There's no one on the radar screen. Right. And I was living in Italy. So I'm going to come back to the States after being gone for 4 years. So I'm starting from scratch. And that was the thing. It was like, man, like you're going to lose your independence. That's that young man thing, that young 20 something guy. Man, I want to be my own thing. I don't want anyone telling me what to do and hold me back. I want to live my own life and continue having these adventures like I had over here in the Army, living in Europe. And so it was like really a negative thing, and I think that's what a lot of people back then in the 90s, young men, like, I got to heap my independence. And I think that's probably been something that's been going on for a lot longer than that. But when I think about that, that's why I see this, healthy marriages, good for mental and physical health. There are some good things about it, that it's almost like, I don't know why is it just young men at that age trying to just hold on to something, but also healthily married parents are great for children. Children who are involved in or live in a household with a healthy marriage have less mental, physical, educational, and social problems. That's what the APA again is reporting.
Sure. Now the stipulation there, of course, is that, as you said, happily married parents.
Yes, healthy, happy. So that's going to be, no raging alcoholic beating the wife or
right.
or anything terrible like that, right? So in those things, a marriage like that is going to be probably exactly the opposite for children. They probably have children in those households will have more mental, physical, educational, and social problems. I'm quite sure. If you've got a guy coming home, drunk every night, throwing things around the house, right?
Of course.
So there's some good things, and you can just hey, the APA, they're saying, hey, the people who are happily and healthily married, there's some good things there for both them and their kids. But then again, the stat shows when you look at it, 40 to 50% of first-time marriages end in divorce. That's according to a website, an organization that keeps track of these things called yourdivorcequestions.org. 40 to 50 of first-time marriages And if second marriages of people, if there's a divorce and someone gets remarried, they're reporting the same place 60 to 65% of those end in divorce.
So there's actually a higher instance of divorce in second marriages.
That's correct.
I'm surprised by that too, because you would think whatever learnings you had from the first go around, you would apply to the choice of partner, to the type and amount of compromising that you do in the marriage. It seems like you would think statistically that the divorce rate would be lower for the second marriage.
I would think that too, but my feeling, if you're asking me, Steve, why do you think that is? I'm thinking people are like, well, if I'm not getting along with this person, I've done it before, I can leave. So I'll just leave because I don't want to live through that anymore.
For sure.
It's like, hey, this is something that's done, right? This is something that I can do. I lived through the last one. I can live through this one. But, and that talks to a lot of maybe what you said, the preparation and like what types of lessons are people taking from divorce?
Yeah.
If people aren't taking a lesson from it and just treating as that this is just a thing that happens, then maybe they're not being reflective upon that first one, like you said, you would expect people to do. Maybe they're not, maybe they should.
Well, there's something else that I would add to, obviously these statistics are disheartening. And I think most people are familiar with that. That's a very common thing, that half of marriages end in divorce. And I've observed and said this before to my wife in conversation, like it's a weird thing when you go to a wedding or you think about weddings that you've been to, and you have to acknowledge right off the bat that half of them are probably going to dissolve at some point. And it's because I think there's a huge portion of the population that simply doesn't appreciate how challenging it actually is. It's everybody walks down the aisle with good intentions. Like everybody believes they're going to defy these statistics, and the reality has a way of kind of barging in on you.
Yeah, if you people wouldn't get married if they thought that's probably going to be a divorce, right? So, what are the risk factors? How come some of these end? According to yourdivorcequestions.org, again, people getting married too young. These are what they're finding in the statistics when they look at people who've gotten divorced, and they're saying they're young. These are high risk factors. Less education, high school diploma, and or not even a high school diploma. Couples in that group are more likely. Low income, which equates with financial stress.
Yep.
To pay the bills. This was interesting. Unmarried cohabitation with multiple partners. So living with people on a regular basis, that mindset, like, oh no, I'll live with them. They can move in. I'll move in with them. And then, oh no. And so if someone has done this, like, oh, if, for instance, the key here, they're saying if some guy you talk to is getting married and you ask him about his past, and he said, yeah, I've had like 4 women that I've lived with in different apartments I've lived in over the years and it's just this mindset, like, I could switch. It's easy. So that's pretty interesting. And then of course, the premarital pregnancy or childbearing before the marriage. So either that shotgun wedding with the pregnant woman or having the baby before, they're saying that's a thing, like that is showing to be a high risk factor. Why do you think that would be?
I think that's probably because the introduction of a child into the relationship puts incredible demands on both partners. And when you're trying to navigate those initial stages of a marriage, especially if you're adapting to, living with another person for the first time and kind of figuring out, like I said before, figuring out coming to terms with just the amount of compromise that's required in these types of long-term relationships. I think, you inject a child into that, and it just is probably more than a lot of people can manage.
Yeah, it's interesting because you almost the way I think of that is like, hey, this happened. They had an accident, maybe a mistake, and they kept the child, and they're doing the right thing. But it's really hard. And just as you were talking, I was thinking to myself, Brittany and I were married in 1995, and our first child was born he was one of the millennium babies, 2000. So we had 5 years to establish as a couple.
Yeah.
You
Yep.
know, this is us, this is our identity. People like that, because having a kid, you know, a little bit about my background from some reading you've done, and you know that a mom and dad job could be all in, right?
Hmm.
All in. Like it's like you're the dad, you're the mom, like that's your, turns into your identity.
Sure.
And if you don't have a previous we're a couple underlying that, that's got to be tough.
Yeah, for sure.
And the next one here, the high risk factor, no religious affiliation. Now, that's going to be another topic. All right. So we're going to skip that one because we're going to have a topic dealing with religion. Absolutely.
Yeah, I would take issue with that one, and I actually have a lot to say about that. So I look forward to that discussion.
Yeah. I mean, but they're saying people who aren't religious. So, you know, I don't know. I don't think that, to me, I don't know. We'll discuss it on another episode.
Well, I feel like people that aren't religious are probably less likely to feel pressured into a marriage in the first place.
That would be true. You know, I would believe you. But I would say too, if you think about religion, I don't know where I'm going to answer the question on belief, but I do say that, you know, organized religion is that, you know, I don't know. So it just matters, belief or religion. I think that's something that's got to be hashed out there.
Yeah,
Because some people believe one thing and act in a certain way according to that, but they don't, you know, belong to an organization. So,
sure.
but anyway, then we go to the last of the risk factors that were listed by this group: parents divorce or divorces. So if someone came from a home where their parents were divorced once or more, then that was another thing that they're saying. And then these things, it's not causation here, right? That's
Yeah,
your favorite thing, right? Correlation does,
correlation.
yep,
That's
does
right.
not equal causation. So, but when they just look at the people and have them fill out questionnaires, this is what they're finding, that these are some what they would call risk factors.
Yeah. Well, I've seen where, and I think that this is an established thing, and you could probably read journal articles on this, but people tend to subconsciously recreate their environments or aspects of their what you would call your family of origin. In other words, the circumstances that you grew up in, the house that you grew up in you tend to recreate some of that stuff when you become an adult.
I think there's a big I have there's a big thing called modeling, right? You're just gonna. It's like I'm reading a book now that someone suggested, like a group of women where I work suggested I get it, not because I'm having issues in my marriage, but they say it's just really good, and I don't have it with me. It's called, it's like the five love languages or something.
Oh yeah.
And in reading it, one of the things, this guy, he's just a, you know, longtime marriage counselor, has written a couple of books. He's like, it's like you're thinking what I saw growing up, and then you're married, then you're like, well, I'm gonna, if my dad came home and expected to have dinner ready and sit down and read the paper and watch TV and have a beer and then have dinner and it should be ready for, that's what people are like, that person's going to expect that.
Sure.
And they have to look at it and be like, wait a minute, why am I expecting that? Because that's what I really want, or that's how it should really be, or that's just because I'm like, I guess that's how you do it, you know. So people aren't putting as much thought into that, I think. You know, and modeling people, like you said, it's like you've got this pattern of pre-wired, here's how it's supposed to go, and you're just following the blueprint because that's what you saw, right?
Yeah. Now imagine if you, as a boy, if you didn't have a dad around, then as you get older, you yourself have to figure out and define what manhood means because there is no model.
Yeah, I mean, I can't imagine that. I don't know, but yeah, it's got to be tough because you're going to have to probably look at other people that you see. You're going to see things on, you know, if you see something on maybe a movie and you say, that guy, I really think the way that that relationship, that looks good. So maybe you have to model after something or try to get role models. I don't know.
Sure, sure. It becomes like an amalgamation of all these different things.
Yeah. I mean, whether people, it's mentors they've had through their lives or bosses at work or teachers or whatever. There's common reasons for people getting divorced. When we talk about, we saw those risk factors, but the common reasons, there's a prominent marriage researcher named he's Dr. Scott Stanley, and he's a therapist, and he defines he says one of the biggest common reasons is lack of commitment. And what he's defining when he says this, if commitment is having a long-term view of the marriage that helps us not get overwhelmed by problems and challenges we experience day to day, to include personal dedication to the marriage, desire to be together in a future state, and identity as a couple. And I'll have to say, I'll let you chime in here, but identity as a couple, I wouldn't have that with my wife if we didn't have that 5 years, without kids, I believe.
Sure.
And we talk about retirement and where we want to live. And we look at websites for housing and places that would be good to live. And and we're talking about our retirement dates and everything. So that we definitely have a future state, and it is a bigger than the, oh shit, the car payments due.
Yeah.
So for us, I think that I like the way he defines commitment.
Yeah. I would just add to that, I think marriage is really not in line with our evolutionary biology. You have to be able to recognize the greater good beyond your biology,
beyond your instincts and urges.
Right. I mean, I think that's why, where a lot of the infidelity stuff comes from is you have to recognize that the stability that a marriage provides you is ultimately worth more than that, the instinct to, spread your seed or whatever.
Yeah. And I've got some research coming up, some numbers that I think that will definitely back that up, what you're saying. Now, I'm not sure, it's funny, the guy who wrote that book, The 5 Love Languages, and I don't have his name in front of me, but he was sort of indicating that, I guess there's psychologically some things he believes, I don't know if it's true, but where people might say, oh, that open marriage idea, he said those things are psychologically damaging because people really have this need for, it's fine. Like a guy's like, well, maybe I could have someone else, but if my wife does, oh, that's
sure.
Really, really bothersome to people. Well,
that's an interesting point, because to what I was saying is in evolutionary terms, we're not really cut out for marriage. And yet it almost suggests otherwise when you think that the idea of your partner being with someone else is very upsetting to people. It's just innately upsetting because maybe on some level, in fact, we have evolved to prefer, one single stable partner.
I mean, it's there's animals in the animal kingdom. You see wolves are generally monogamous, right? And there's some other, I don't, can't think of it now, but I know,
there's some birds that mate for life.
Some birds. And so those are true things that can happen. So other reasons besides that commitment, or lack of commitment for reasons given by the divorced are, too many arguments. Of course, we just talked about this infidelity and that bad feeling. You just can't deal with it. People oh, we were just too young, So these aren't the risk factors when you just ask questions about the statistics of it. These are what people are saying, right?
Yeah.
And lack of relationship equality. So what they're talking about there, he was bossing me around all the time. He's in charge. We weren't making decisions together. And I felt
one person has all the power in the marriage.
Yeah. And then lack of marriage preparation. And that is huge to me. And we are going to talk about that a little bit later, but being prepared with expectations, I think. And then of course, abuse, right? Abuse is a reason for that divorce sometimes happens. And I think valid reasons for divorce that we could say, I don't know if valid's the word to use, but infidelity, someone is addicted to something, any kind of addiction, and they're not focused on the marriage, or they're not giving their all into the marriage.
Well, addictions have a way of really undermining trust and eroding marital foundations, because typically with an addiction, there's a lot of lying that goes along with that. There's a lot of deceit that goes along with trying to cover up the addiction. So, I know that because my wife actually works as an addiction counselor. So I have a little bit of insight into that, and it's like poison to a marriage.
Yeah, and I read a book not too long ago, where it was a story of this kid growing up in Ireland. It was like a normal thing back then, like all the women in this guy's story, the men going to the pub on the way home from work after getting their paycheck and coming home, and they're like living in poverty, and
Yeah.
they're blowing they're just blowing it on whiskey and beer, and then coming home and raging on the family.
So
And
related to that, isn't that where the idea of prohibition came from? Was that it was actually the women who were coming forward and saying, "Look, we got to get this alcohol out of here. They're spending all their money on this stuff."
I'm not sure. It wouldn't surprise me. And did that happen? We'd have to research this, and and did that happen when women's suffrage, like they're like, oh, now we can vote, so you better start listening, right?
Right.
That might have been something there. So, another valid reason, the addictions of all kinds, and abuse of all kinds, right? Whether that's just mental abuse, physical abuse, whatever other types of abuse that you could come up with.
Well, here's a note on abuse. I think that there's a lot of marriages and a lot of relationships where there is some degree of abuse, whether it's emotional abuse or psychological abuse, where the abuser doesn't even realize, maybe the abused doesn't even realize that they're being abused. This stuff, you hear the word abuse and you think of someone getting beat, which is terrible, but there's many different types of abuse, and some of it is so subtle and is such an undercurrent in the marriage that you could be involved in a relationship like this and yourself not even recognize the signs.
Yeah, even if just very subtle things. I knew one, of course, I'm not going to use any names here, but there was one guy who I knew who was involved in some sporting events that my sons were involved in. And he like made nasty jokes about his wife all the time.
Ooh, yeah, red flag.
And I was like, to the point where, I would come home and talk to my wife and say, did you hear what he said? Like, and he pulls it off as it's like it's joke. Ha ha ha. And I'm like, if you're constantly saying that, especially in front of other people, that's a form of it. Because she's sitting there thinking like, God, like I feel now even if she's living with, he's saying this, she's living with that he's saying this in front of other people,
or she's been in that reality for so long that she's internalized it and doesn't even recognize that it's a problem anymore. I mean, that's another very dangerous phase.
Yeah, and imagine if she's like, well, that's just the way men are, like, or something, like that's just how it is now this is her model now, right? There's all kinds, but I think any of those reasons, sometimes other things people give maybe are easier ways out, but I think these things are like, you need to get out of that.
Well, shouldn't, because I would think like another very valid reason would be just pure incompatibility. And there's a number of ways people get to that point, but I mean, say that you get married too young, or you have some critical component of your worldview changes over time, and you end up, you realize that you're with the wrong partner, pick the wrong partner.
I think that could happen and that could be valid, but I would really think that would come from lack of that marriage preparation, and or lack of open and honest communication throughout.
Yeah.
Because if someone's like, like if I told my wife, like, I want to be a survivalist in Alaska, and that's what I want to do when I retire. And she's like,
springing it on her.
Yeah. She's like, oh no, that's not happening. Like I have joked with her when we've seen some of those shows on TV where those people are out there hacking it in I forget what it's called, but it's on like Discovery Channel. And if there's nothing on, you're flipping through, you're like, this guy like went out there by himself and he built a cabin and he's got a dog sled and wow, that's crazy. But it's sort of interesting to see he could actually pull it off and not die. Right. And I'm like, yeah, we could go do that. And she's like, if we do, it's over.
Yeah.
She goes, you can go do that. But
not on board.
Yeah, I won't be there. So yeah, I agree with you. That's another one that complete lack of compatibility. So,
but no, it's a great point. What you said about that connects directly to lack of preparation.
Exactly.
You have
Exactly.
an obligation to know what you're getting into.
Yeah. Yeah. So I looked in a little bit to what people are saying in certain publications, like, sanfrancisco.com, sanfrancisco.com, theatlantic.com, some of these sort of pop culture type of things, saying like the case against marriage, why they're saying in different articles people shouldn't be married, or that it's completely valid for people to be like, no way, right? So they're given some of these things. It only provides a false sense of emotional and financial stability. Now, I don't think that holds water. Do you?
Well, no, because I mean, you have to provides a false sense. Well, isn't that up to the individual to decide?
Yeah, exactly. Now, the next one, I could see why it would hold some people back, like especially younger people who may have grown up and seeing this in their family. Hey, divorce isn't easy. It's tough on kids. It's tough. It's hard on you legally. It's there's money. It's not easy. So maybe don't. I don't want to get into that. Um,
Yeah. I mean,
and
knowing that you have a 50-50 shot of having to go through it, that's a valid deterrent.
yeah. So I think that probably is. I'm not saying it's right, but I mean that's probably definitely why some people are like, yeah, I'm against it. I don't want to get married. An interesting thing that was brought up was commitment versus contract. So saying marriage in the terms of society is like illegal. You get that marriage license, it's a legal contract, and then you're bound in all sorts of legal ways,
Yep. Yep.
which is what makes one of the things that makes divorce so difficult.
Sure.
People are saying that's not the same as commitment as a couple. People can do that and be committed and be together and not have to have the contract.
Oh, yeah, I agree. And I would even say, like, from my own experience, by the time that my wife and I got married, we had been together, we had 10 years under our belt. And in those 10 years, we had a foundation of trust and mutual respect and goals about the future and ideas about what it meant to support the other person that went far beyond what I mean. I know people who have been married for less time than that, and their relationships are couldn't even compare the two.
Sure. And but here's what then I think of this. Then we have common law marriage, where someone's like, well, you in the state, whatever state you're in, like if you've been cohabitating, living basically as a couple for 10 years, then you're like, well, like there's legal things all, and it's like, hey, if someone, I don't know that that's a good thing, right? Because
I don't think that's good at all. That sounds like
yeah,
the state foisting itself upon your
it,
life
it,
and your
it totally is.
choices.
But
Yeah.
you've heard of it. This is a thing, right? Um,
Yeah. I'm not, I don't know much about it, or like how
yeah,
it varies state to state, or how long before it comes into effect. But what it sounds like is the
it's
state's
basically
basically saying, like, yeah, if you don't invite us into your life and give us some dictatorial control over your life and your legal personhood, then we're just going to take control of it after a certain amount of time.
yeah, which is the state taking over that last argument. Someone says, I can be committed and love someone and I don't have to have a contract legally. And then the state says, well, after 10 years, you do. And you see these things in a lot of areas. There's also areas where people are cohabitating, even if it's like, someone, if you let a buddy move into your house because he's in hard times and you're like, we've got a spare bedroom, stay here till you get back on your feet. And then he's there for like a year. And then you're like, you know what, that's it, get the hell out of here. You're dead weight. They could be like, I'm not leaving. And a police officer, how long he's been living here, like, you
Yeah.
have to go through eviction process now.
It's like squatter rights or
Yeah,
something.
yeah, it's crazy. So um but that's sort of a thing that the state is taking over. So, and that sort of goes to another comment, is was commitment versus contract. That was talking about the legal part, and commitment versus marriage. So this is like in the eyes of the church, in the eyes of society, like I don't have to say, yeah, I'm married, and have society say, oh, you're married. And maybe people are like, you can be committed. It's the same argument, but it's just not with the legal thing, that like marriage itself isn't as important as the people in the relationship. So
Mm-hmm, mm-hmm.
so sort of the same thing. And one of the arguments was marriage weakens other social ties. What do you think about that? So like friends, like, well, I can't see my buddies.
Well, I can certainly see how the demands of a marriage would take time and energy away from those other types of relationships. But I don't know that that's necessarily a bad thing. I mean,
Yeah, I don't think it holds water. Because I have some friends, people I've known, oh, it's specifically some people I've worked with. They're like, oh yeah, like it's the boys' night out or it's the girls' night out, and I'm like, well, what does that mean? And they're like, I don't want to spend all the time at home with my wife. I want to have a thing where I can go out and do my own thing.
yeah, yeah.
And people who have those definitely all the time, I've known people, and it doesn't work out well. I'm
Hmm.
just saying, but it's like, and they're like, well, what do you do? I was like, well, I hang out with my wife. Like I go home after work and we do things together.
Yeah. Well, certainly healthy to have activities, that are kind of outside the sphere of the marriage. I don't think there's anything wrong with that, but right, I could see how that could be problematic. Again, it probably just comes down to the individual. Because if when you say I'm going to hang with my bros, and what you mean is 3 nights a week you're going to the strip club, I could see that. I could see that.
That's a problem.
Yeah, that's going to be problematic.
Or you're going to the club and blowing your paycheck on $1,000 bottle of champagne with your
Right, right.
buddies, which I've never done, by the way. So um, last one they had here about the case against marriage, they said, this is sort of like, I'm just going to say this is sort of like the hippie outlook. Meaningful love should not be limited to the narrow confines of marriage. Okay, sure. Does that even mean anything?
Well, I think it connects directly back to what we were saying before, where if people have tried to do these kind of like open relationships that maybe works for some people, but generally it seems to it results in a crashing and burning of the relationship, because there's a lot of emotional components that get stirred up in situations like that.
Yeah, going back to those open marriages, like a guy's like, yeah, I'm good with it, I'm good with it, and then suddenly, like, he's good with it, but then he's started to get jealous, like, well, I'm not so good with her doing it, type
Yeah,
of thing.
right.
I feel like that's always going to happen, and maybe that happens with females too, right? I would, um, but so my take on all of these case against marriage things, just a quick thing, I sort of feel like, well, it's like bias, right? What do they call that bias? People have already decided, made their decision. I don't.
Confirmation bias.
Yes, I feel like this is all confirmation bias.
Hmm.
Someone's like, I don't think I want to get married, and here's all the reasons why. Just trying to sort of say, look, see, this is right. It's like, hey, if you don't want to, don't. Right?
Yeah, it's a very it's not for everyone. And like I said before, you have an obligation to know yourself well enough before you take that step. I mean, and I also recognize that just because I'm personally, I've been married with my partner for 16 years. We've been married for 6, very happily married. I recognize that that's not for everybody. It's very demanding in some ways. And, I have friends who are in their late 30s at this point, early 40s, are not married. They very much enjoy meeting new people, and they enjoy that kind of initial phase of the relationship, and they're basically serial daters. And as long as they're having these relationships with other like-minded people, that's their prerogative. I mean, I would even salute them for recognizing I'm not marriage minded, and rather than going down that path and then having it implode.
Sure, sure. Yeah, as long as the other people understand that, right? So opposite ways, case for marriage. There's a book by Linda Waite, who's a University of Chicago professor. And I'll go through these quick. I think a lot of these sort of make sense, but they say people who are married engage in more healthy behaviors at times. And I'm thinking what they're saying is you're not out probably smoking and drinking and staying up too late and all this stuff.
Sure, sure.
Statistics show, the mortality rates. People will live longer.
I have read that as well.
And they say partnered sex frequency and satisfaction is higher. Wages, of course, she's just saying this is the case for it. And again, we're going to go to your thing, correlation. What is it again? Correlation doesn't equal causation.
Right.
So wages, higher wages, more assets and wealth, children's well-being. We talked about this before. Married people have, bottom line, it's just 100% true statistically, less dropouts in their children. They're living in less poverty. Their children are not involved in as much criminal activity as a juvenile. And like I said, there's no evidence that the links between these things in marriage show causality, but it's just numbers that are interesting.
Yeah, a lot of this stuff is directly connected to the stability that comes with a committed married lifestyle. I mean, you have basically, if both partners work, which is I think the norm these days, you have essentially double the resources in terms of you have,
Yeah.
two salaries. So it just makes dealing with life that much less stressful. And then as far as with the kids' well-being, I don't think anyone could argue that stability isn't good for kids. I mean, it's good for kids to have a stable, structured environment versus being surrounded by chaos. So
Agreed.
yeah,
Agreed. And moving around and back and forth and being shuffled back and forth and often being played against,
and
like, oh, I'm gonna play like to try to hurt the other parent. I've seen that.
that's to say nothing of imagine if as a kid your parents are divorced, you live with your mom, and your mom has a string of boyfriends that are coming in and out of your life. I mean, that's that you can't even measure the effects that would have on a kid, especially a boy.
Yeah, yeah. Oh, yeah, I can only imagine. This is still the same woman, the same professor, because she did a study. It's like, okay, so if all these things are good, then why is it declining? Why is it going down? And we touched on this a little bit at the start. She looked at it and said, listen, more women are working and have financial independence, like could make enough money in this day and age, have the education, get a job that's good enough that she can support herself. So women aren't looking to latch on to someone because they need something like maybe that happened in the 40s and the 30s, right? And of course, we just went into this earlier talking sort of about it. When high divorce rates, people are leery to do it because they're like, if it's half of them fail or almost, then why would I, that's like, I'm not putting all my money on the roulette table in Vegas, right? Because there's a great chance I'm not gonna, I'm gonna blow it all.
Yeah.
Um, and then she reports, this professor, that women's increased earnings are compounded by a declining financial well-being in young men. Um, so she's talking about men actually on average as compared to women with the same credentials, degrees, experience are actually sometimes going down.
Yeah.
So
Yep. Well, that's a whole other, that could be a topic in and of itself.
sure. So I mean, I think those things, they could be explanatory of why marriages declined. It's just the sign of the times, and I think a lot of that has to do with women being able to be looked at more equally in society these days, and being able to get the jobs and being able to make a big salary. And I think that's a good thing, right?
Yeah, sure.
If you're comfortable discussing, when you think about this, and I do believe part of my outlook on how Brittany and I handle problems, things that come up, and we don't just instantly go to forget it, it's over, right? And I think there is a big part of that is her parents. She had parents that stayed together, you know, until she was an adult and beyond. And my parents are in their 80s and are together. And I'm not saying they didn't even have any problems, but there was no divorce in my parents. So modeling that, I think both of us came into this and we weren't like, well, divorce is normal, so we can just do that if shit goes wrong. Right?
Sure.
So I don't know if I mean, it seems like you had a little bit of experience where you saw that, and it's almost sometimes I'm wondering, and I'm asking you this. You don't have to answer if you don't want to, but I know people who don't drink alcohol because they're like, oh, I knew someone in my family who was a raging alcoholic, and I'm not touching this stuff because as a child, I saw this terrible example, and I could tell 100% it was bad. It was not good. And there's no way I'm doing that. I saw the poor road, for any other drugs or any other thing. There's some people that I know like that. I could see the same thing where sometimes if people see divorce in their family, And they're like, well, this is a thing. It happens. It's normal. You know, it can happen if things don't work out, you spread. But then I could see other people go, oh, that was so terrible that I know that's a bad thing. And I'm going to like commit and stick with the marriage now. What do you think about that?
Yeah, well, what I would say about that, and it's speaking personally, is just, my childhood was steeped in chaos and instability. My parents were young and irresponsible, and ultimately had three. I have a brother and sister, so they did have three kids, and it was just chaos. They didn't get along. It was a lot of moving around. There was a lot of dysfunction there, and you come into adulthood and you reflect backwards. You try to improve your situation. You work through the things that you can work through, and then you make a choice, and you either end up repeating a lot of that stuff, or you commit yourself to being better, to doing better, to stopping the cycle, to making sure that in your own life, in your own marriage, with your own kids and your own family, you create a situation that remedies all the things that you thought were broken. So for me, as an adult, I'm all about creating a calm, stable, chaos-free environment, and I'm very lucky that my wife understands that. She has the same kind of desire, and so far we've been able to do that. And eventually, I think there are no kids in the picture yet, but there may be at some point, and I just want to ensure that my kids have a very different experience.
Well said. Well said. Yeah, that makes sense, man. And I think some people just model and follow, and that's how life is normal. But people who are more reflective and can take that and say, hold on now, this is not how things are. Life is about decisions, and I can decide to be different, right?
Yeah, and I'm lucky because I had friends when I was younger, and I would go to their house, and I did get to see what a functional marriage looked like up close. I got to see what a functional household looked like up close, and I'm very grateful to some of those families for modeling that, because it did show me that, like, oh, okay, what I am living in and like what my life is not doesn't have to be the norm.
Yeah, yeah. Well, it's excellent that you had some place like that. Some people might not in certain neighborhoods, areas, and certain communities. There might be kids who are in a chaotic situation and they can go to someone else's house and it's the same.
Sure, sure.
And maybe those are some of the people like, this is how it is. This is life, right? I was going to give us both a chance. We always say when we're talking about these things, and this is a little bit of a different topic from some of the ones we've talked about, but to find a way forward, we always talk about that. Is there a good way? Is there a solution? And we don't really have that here, but I think to sort of maybe tell people, here's what I think best practices have been for me, and then your side too. So I'll start if that's okay.
Yeah, go for it.
I think one of the biggest things, pre-planning and expectations. When my wife and I decided to get married, when we were talking about it, we talked about everything. Do you want kids? Um, how religious are you? Are you like have to go to church every Sunday, and what? Even down to holidays, it was like, well, I do Christmas in Christmas morning. I don't do Christmas Eve. A lot like opening presents. We talked about that. Um, um,
It's very
what type,
granular.
yeah, yeah. What type of home do you want to live in? What does, suburbs, townhouse, country, do we want to strive for that? We're knowing that we can't go right. We weren't made of money, right? Told you I made, $8 an hour and she made 10 when we got married. And
Yeah, you guys came up together.
yeah. And like, do you want pets? Could you imagine if you're, hey, we know each other, we're going to get married, it's all blissful and great, we have a great time, and then someone's like, yeah, I want to get a couple of German shepherds, and the other person's like, no way. Like,
Mhm.
you have to have these discussions, right? So that's the pre-planning was huge. Even like, how many kids do you think, etc., right? So we talked about all of those things, and then the next thing for us is transparency. Cell phones, she's got my uh 4 digits to unlock my iPhone. I've got hers. We're on the same iCloud with iPhones. So like I texted a buddy who lives in like North Dakota the other day. He was someone I was in the Army with, and he was like, I texted him a link about and made a comment um, based upon a memory we had, and he was like, "Yeah, I'm not opening this. Who is this?" He was like, "It says this other name when I get it on his iPhone, and it said my wife's name." So we were like totally. That was sort of an anomaly. It doesn't happen like that all the time, but we've got one personal email.
Yeah.
So every email that comes in, like every time that you email me, she sees it.
Yeah.
And she doesn't open them because she's like, "Oh yeah, I know he talks about Ben," but she's not like, "Who is this?" But she could be. She could click in, and I tell her all the time. Sometimes she's like, "You got this mail," and I'm like, "Go ahead and open it up. I don't care. Tell me what it's about." Right? All our bank accounts, our paychecks go to the same checking account. And I know people are like, "Steve, you're crazy. Something goes sideways in this marriage. You are a goner." And well, you know what? But I'm all in. Everything's joint. All the cars, the house. It's not like I have the 20 cars. Don't think that.
Your collection of exotic cars is all shared.
Yeah. all the 3 Kias, right? Actually, well, there's 4 Kias, but my sons are involved in those, right? So
gotcha. Yeah, I think this is great if this works for you, but I do think that this isn't, and probably I'm sure there are people listening to this who are thinking like, wow, that definitely, I think, makes you guys a bit of an outlier. I mean, that's a level of transparency that I don't think most people strive for, obtain, maintain.
I know
it's definitely extreme.
I mean, my parents have separate bank accounts where their retirement income goes into. I know because they talk about it.
Yeah.
The next thing is maintenance. You need to talk and discuss about, what's going to be with, are you going to go on dates? What discussions? What are you talking about? Sex, romance, what interest do you have? What type of time do you need apart? Do you like, hey, I'm going to go to this movie? Like we said, sometimes you can go do things on your own. You've got a hobby. I'm going to go run on the trail 5 miles with the dog. All these things. So you have to talk about the maintenance, but there is maintenance to it. You can't say like, well, we'll just, coexist in a house and have sex every now and then. You should be like,
I could see people, and I agree with you, but I could see people, you have to know yourself pretty well to even have these discussions. I mean, I think there's a lot of people out there who, even if they were asked these questions, wouldn't be able to answer them because, it requires some life experience and some introspection. And you have to know yourself well enough to know how you're going to, fit with another person.
Yeah. And people change as they grow older. There's differences in the way people need things and what their desires are and everything. Sure. Things change. But I think that important that person said, the guy we talked about earlier, about the future vision, planning. What's our future? Where do you see yourself? Do you want to buy a beach home? Do you want to live on the beach? Do you want, what do you want it to be like? When do we retire? What's that going to look like? And are we selling this house? Well, let's start preparing it. All these plans for the future. So I think that's important to have a plan and a vision of, we can see ourselves it retired.
Totally.
And where we're going to be and what we think that future state should be.
Yep.
What types of things we should be doing. Like I'll be in a little office in a retirement home near the water, doing a balanced podcast with Ben, right? Every week.
Right around the corner.
Yeah. And then the last thing I want to say, I know a very controversial figure is Jordan B. Peterson. Are you aware of this guy?
I've seen some of his stuff. Yeah.
Yeah. 12 Rules for Life. And he's a clinical psychologist and he's had his issues and everything's very controversial to some people, but I've read some of his books and listened to some of his lectures. And one thing that I really take away from him that I think makes sense, he said, his big thing is, have the damn argument. And my wife and I try to do this, and that doesn't sound positive, but
well, in other words, don't bottle the stuff up.
Yeah. Like he said, if you don't like the way the person fixes the bed in the morning or how they don't fix the bed in the morning, and you don't like that, and and you just like, well, it's just a little thing. I'll live with it. He said, don't do that. Say something about it. Because after 30 years, you come to a hard time in your life. And that little dumb thing, the way the person, you know, sips their tea or whatever it is, if there's the way they leave their shoes out or something, if it bothers you a little bit, say something. And you might not get what you want, but at least you've had the argument. You're like, and then you're like, done. Okay.
Uh-huh.
You know, I
Uh-huh.
don't like it. And I've said what I had to say, and
Yeah.
we're moving on, but not after 30 years, finally one day snapping. And I'm going to, throw the table across the room. Damn it. So those little things will bottle up inside. So have it, figure it out, talk about it. And, maybe a lot of times things change, like, oh, well, she does the laundry and washer and dryer. I do it too, but she's more in there. And then the basket's full. And the thing is like, oh, I'm taking the basket and I'm going to go fold it and put it all away, because there was the damn argument once. Like, well,
Yeah. And I think a lot of that stuff, every marriage is unique. And a lot of that stuff, that kind of rhythm, that stuff evolves organically in time. You
Yeah.
won't necessarily hash that all out the day that you move in together. But over time, if you communicate, if you, as you said, have the damn arguments, if the stuff gets aired out, if you're both willing to compromise, you figure out a healthy equilibrium.
Yeah, and it does come. And if you don't have the damn arguments as things come up and as you run into roadblocks or bumps in the road, then the rhythm never gets there, right? It never gets there.
Yeah.
So I didn't know whether you had any things of your own to add that you think just happen to be really best practices. Not that anyone's going to listen to us and do what we say, but maybe someone can take something away and say, wow, maybe I try that. I mean, they're not probably going to um, be as transparent as maybe I am. You said I sound like an outlier, and I think I am, but maybe one of those things, right?
Well, yeah. So one thing that I think is in stark contrast to what you were saying is that my wife and I, when we were having these discussions, we recognized early on, like, wow, it seems like a lot of married people that we know fight about money. Money seems to be a constant source of friction in a lot of relationships. And we decided very early on, like, look, we're both going to work at least until we have kids. We'll figure it out at that time. But while we're both working, while we're both earning money, let's just maintain our money separately. And we'll split the cost of our lifestyle. She can go out and buy whatever she wants. She makes her own money. She's an adult. She doesn't need me. There's this thing, I've seen this a lot where, like, one person will buy something and then they have to somehow sneak it into the house and then act like it's just no. This old thing, I've had this thing for, I never wanted that to be a component of my relationship. And so that's just one example. For us, it works. The money is separate. We're both responsible. We kind of like run our own financial ships, and it seems to work out pretty well. And I just offer that up as a point of comparison to your situation. The other thing I'll say is that, as I said before, everyone is unique. They're very complex. There's a lot of different dynamics at play. It has a lot to do with personality, with love language, as you mentioned, that book. And people should recognize that. I think people get caught up in the idea of it. They look at it through these rose-colored glasses and like, oh, the wedding, and we're going to do this, and we're going to have this kind of cake, and it's going to be so, and then we're going to live happily ever after. But happily ever after requires an incredible amount of compromise, and it's often not that happy. It's often there's difficult things that have to be worked through and overcome. There's many challenges, but if you choose well, and if you know yourself, this is assuming that you're even someone who is like, that marriage is even for you, because I don't think it's for everybody. And I think knowing that before you go down the pathway, just you save yourself a lot of strife and headaches if you kind of know what you're getting into.
Agreed. It's interesting, you know, to try to wrap it up. I think, like, you know, I, an institution is what it is for a reason, I believe. And I think back to when I was that 24-year-old getting out of the army and thinking like now, wow, I'm so opposite of that now, thinking of that no way, I'm never, I'm so glad I got married. Like you said, it is hard work. It is not easy. If someone thinks it's going to be easy to have that compromise and to build that routine and to have that future state, that expectation, and to work together on it for years. And then if you raise children, that's more, and then you own a property and all this stuff. It is hard work, but I believe if you're willing to put that work in, and you plan that future, that you can get there. And one last thing I'd say is, man, sometimes I look at my wife in a moment of reflection and I say, like, I look at him like, I can't even believe how this happened. Like, how I look at this person is so close to me, like the closest person in the world to me. And I don't even know how that happens. Because like you think about a kid looking at your parents, or the closeness you may feel there with siblings, but it's just totally different. And this is someone who started so separate from me in a separate
Total stranger.
And our thing is now, like, this is my family now, and everyone else is relatives.
Yeah. You've talked about that philosophy before. I
Yeah.
like that a lot. I've actually thought about that a bunch since we had that conversation before. But there's certainly value in that outlook. I think at the time, the way that you framed it up was like the difference between relatives and family.
Yeah.
And family is actually a much smaller circle than most people think.
Yeah. And I think about, like, when I was a kid, I was like, and we lived away, separate from where my parents grew up. So it was just like my mom, my dad, my brothers, and my sister and I, and we were out there separate. And then, like, everyone else was relatives. And I guess it was easier for me to come up with that, because it was like, we're in Maryland, and then there's a group in Chicago, and then there's a group in Texas. And like, you don't see them but maybe once a year, if that, or once every 2 years. And so it's like, it was easy. They were like far removed, and just like, hey, this is us, we're here, this is our nucleus right here, and other people are now, like, we're taking care of this first.
Yeah.
That's most important. So, well, I mean, I think seems like we're both positive on the outlook of marriage, even though we come at it from different angles, which I think is a healthy for listeners to say, hey, it's just not one way to be positive. So hopefully people get something out of that.
Yeah. And the listener should take everything that we've said here with a grain of salt, because we're both in long-term marriages. I think we're both happily married. So there's obviously we are marriage people. But I recognize that not everyone is. So,
and we're not professionals or marriage counselors, just two regular guys.
Right. All right. Well, that does it for this episode of Balance. Thanks very much for listening. Balance is produced by myself and Steve. Our music is performed by Four Giants. You can hear more of their excellent stuff on Spotify, Bandcamp, or wherever you prefer to stream. As always, we welcome your thoughts, comments, topic ideas, and constructive criticism. You can email us at benstevebalancedpodcast@gmail.com. Until next time, I'm Ben.
And I'm Steve.
And this has been Balanced.